I am a huge fan of Frasier. I've been watching the series since I was a kid when it first aired back in the 90s, and I've rewatched it quite a few times. I have the entire series on DVD, and most recently, I've been binging through Frasier again because of the new series, Frasier 2023, Season 12, Frasier reboot, whatever they're calling this sequel series to the original Frasier. That part's kind of confusing. So I watched the first two episodes, and I'm going to do a review of it. The first part will be non-spoilers, and then we'll get into spoilers as well. By the way, the first episode of Frasier 2023, as I'm going to call it, is officially free on YouTube on the Paramount Plus channel. I will link that episode below in the description section in case you just want to watch the first episode yourself before you decide whether or not to invest a little bit of money into Paramount Plus. If you already have Paramount Plus, well, good news. You can watch both episodes of Frasier 2023 right now. And every week, a new episode will come out from now through December 7th. So there'll be a new episode a week. Only 10 episodes, by the way. So the sequel series, first season, is 10 episodes, whereas the original series was 24 episodes. And I'm going to be honest, I feel like the series premiere was rushed. It's off to a rocky start compared to, say, the first episode of the original series of Frasier, which I just rewatched recently. So it's definitely fresh in my mind, especially all the times I've watched through the series itself. But it has potential to be a decent sequel series. I just feel like with the first episode, without spoiling it, that they could have given it a bit more time, even if they had to make the first episode an hour long just to flesh things out a little bit more. I think that would have been totally fine. But yeah, the first episode kind of rushed. So Kelsey Grammer is back as Frasier. That's definitely a major plus. He's always been Frasier, always will be, from Cheers to, well, the new Frasier series. And there's some supporting characters that show some potential, slower interest than the original series characters. That's going to be a problem. But I hope that the writers and the directors are able to work with the cast and really flesh out their characters throughout the first season. But it really does feel like this series is in the shadow of the original Frasier series, and it does show on numerous occasions. So that's one thing that I am kind of concerned about. But I hope that the show finds its footing before the end of the first season. It's weird because there's already 2 episodes out, and there's only 8 episodes left of this season. And we have no idea if there's going to be future seasons. We can at least hope that there'll be a second season already in the works. Will that be 10 episodes as well? I mean, I realize a lot of shows now don't have as long of a season order as back in the day. Like back in the 90s, like it was common for a sitcom to have 20-something episodes. Nowadays, 10 is good. Like 10 is, I guess, a good number. But that gives the writers and the directors and the cast less time to make an impact with these characters and with their stories that they're trying to tell. But hopefully, the next 8 episodes will knock the rust off and will make these characters and their stories and the arcs that they're going to go through likable, enduring, and of course, jokes. You got to have some jokes. It's a sitcom, for crying out loud, so there definitely needs to be some more funny moments, just like with the original Frasier series. So yeah, I'm going to keep watching it, better or worse, week to week from now through December 7th. And my rating, I'm going to take both episode 1 and 2. And for the record, I feel like episode 2 did a better job than episode 1. So that's a good thing. So it starts at episode 1 at the bottom. But if it continues to get better and better of each episode, then that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of these characters are new, but there are some returning characters. And we have the main character, Frasier Crane. But yeah, Kelsey definitely carries the show. But in the original series, it wasn't just Kelsey playing Frasier. It was also Niles, it was Daphne, it was Roz, it was Martin. So it was an ensemble cast. So the other characters are going to have to pick it up. You know, it's heavy lifting. Frasier can't do it all himself. But what I'm seeing so far is an above average show. It's probably better than a lot of other shows that are on TV right now. Unfortunately, once again, it's only available through Paramount Plus. You're not going to be able to watch this on CBS or NBC. I believe it originally aired on NBC back in the day, but it's owned by CBS because it's Paramount, which is kind of interesting. So I'm going to give the first 2 episodes of Frasier 2023 a 6.5 out of 10. Now, after writing down my notes, I did go look at the overall average score, and I was pretty much on the mark. The average score for the first 2 episodes of Frasier 2023 is 6.3 out of 10. So I was a little bit generous by 2 points. Well, 0.2. So 6.5 out of 10. That's how I feel about Frasier 2023 so far. Not a bad start, but not a great start. It's not wowing me or setting the world on fire or making me interested in the next week like the original series did back in the day and still does. So let's go ahead and dive into spoilers because there's been a 20-year jump between the events of the series finale of the original Frasier and the new Frasier show. So a bit of things have happened between these characters, and I'm sure that they're going to get fleshed out a bit more than what we got briefly mentioned a few things. So once again, this is the spoiler section. If you don't want to be spoiled about episode 1 or 2 any further, then go watch those episodes and feel free to come back after you're done with episodes 1 and 2. Frasier 2023 is 20 years later. The time jump definitely makes sense because of the real life time period between the series finale of Frasier and the series premiere of Frasier 2023. So it does make sense. All right, so what has happened in the past 20 years since the events of, Frasier? Frasier moved to Chicago. We knew about that at the end of the series finale. And he met up with, I think her name was Charlotte. And apparently they were together for a while in Chicago, but she eventually dumped him. I don't know if he was dumped recently by Charlotte or many years ago. But while he was in Chicago, he became a successful TV talk show host. I guess he took his, psychology radio show from Seattle and basically took it nationwide or worldwide with a TV syndication deal. So he became kind of like Dr. Phil in, I don't know, does Dr. Phil exist in Frasier? Was there a Dr. Phil cameo? I feel like there might have been. Frasier has retired from the TV show, the fictional show that we never see that existed for, the past 20 years, in which he became very successful and extremely wealthy. The show picks up with him arriving at the Boston airport along with his nephew David, which is the son of Niles and Daphne. They arrive in Boston following Martin's funeral because John Mahoney, who played Martin Crane, passed away back in 2018. And I will say that the first episode was a very touching tribute to not only Martin Crane, but also John Mahoney. There was a couple other people they were paying some respects to at the end credits. But obviously the big one was Martin Crane, John Mahoney. So that was very touching. And it really does suck that we didn't see David Hyde Pierce or Jane Leeves reprise their characters of Niles and Daphne. At the moment, they haven't expressed any interest in reprising their roles, but hopefully maybe in a future season they'll come back. That would be nice. Even if it's just to visit David, that would make sense because, he is their son after all, and he's now living in Boston. He's going to Harvard. And that's the reason why he came back to Seattle, from Seattle to Boston with Frasier. So Frasier attempts to rekindle a relationship with his son, Freddie, a Harvard dropout who's become a Boston firefighter. He's living with his best friend's girlfriend and her newborn son, John. We find out all about this near the end of the episode because at first he claims that Eve is his girlfriend. And there's no mention of John. They kind of keep John under the radar throughout most of the first episode, which is kind of weird. And briefly, when Frasier finds out about John, he thinks that John is Freddie's son. But that's not true. It's just that Eve was the girlfriend of Freddie's best friend, who was also a firefighter, but he was killed in the line of duty. So it's going to be interesting to see how they're affected by the loss of that character and going forward, how everything plays out with Freddie and Eve and John. Another issue that occurred, going back to Martin's funeral, is that Freddie was a no-show. He stayed in Boston. He claimed that he had an emergency come up and he was not able to make it to the funeral, but he basically missed his flight on purpose. And Frasier does confront him about this. And we find out it makes sense because I think they're billing Freddie to be Martin 2.0 because of the similarities between both these characters. Martin was a cop and basically a blue-collar guy. And that's what Freddie is. He's firefighter and a blue-collar guy. And over the past 20 years, Freddie and Martin became close. And it's implied that anytime Freddie had issues, he would call Martin on the phone, his grandfather, and he even would talk to Martin about the loss of his best friend. So I think the loss of his best friend must have happened months prior to Martin's passing, because the baby was only recently born like a month or two ago. But obviously it takes 9 months for the baby to fully mature. So it could have happened shortly after Eve became pregnant. And somewhere in that time span, you had a grieving friend, Freddie, being consoled by Martin in Martin's last few months alive about having to deal with losing, friends on the force, because Martin dealt with loss on the force. He talked about a few friends that were killed in the line of duty when he was a cop back in the original series. So obviously they do a good job of establishing a bond between grandson and grandfather, which makes total sense, because a lot of grandsons have a bond with their grandfather. I mean, I can attest to that as well. So it does work that Freddie would be very similar to Martin. So while in Boston visiting Freddie, Frasier is also attending a speech in a class being held by his lifelong friend, Alan, who they went to school with together. And Alan is a professor at Harvard. And Olivia is the head of the psychology department at Harvard. And once she meets Frasier, she becomes obsessed with the idea of getting Frasier on as a professor at the Harvard psychology department, because, he has some notoriety to him. He was a celebrity, radio talk show host, TV talk show host, very popular. And she believes it would be an incredible boon to have Dr. Frasier Crane as a psychology professor at Harvard. So she eventually is able to talk Frasier into taking a job at Harvard. And it's not really hard to convince him, because he clearly wants to move back to Boston and be closer to Freddie and bond with Freddie and make up for all those years, from Cheers to Frasier to the events in between Frasier and Frasier 2023, that he wasn't really in Freddie's life as much. So you see kind of a reversal here. Whereas Martin moved in with Frasier at the beginning of the original series, and it was Frasier's desire to be closer to his dad, to develop a bond between father and son. It's a reversal. Frasier wanting to be closer to his son. So father, son, son, father. I guess it's a good cycle. It works. But once again, I feel like that this could have been fleshed out a little bit better. Maybe a little bit more time should have been given in the first episode, because there's a lot of info bombs that happen that just quickly go by that you have to go back and rewatch real quick to find out about these characters and whatnot. I'm guessing Niles and Daphne are still together. I don't know if they have any other children besides David. I would guess that they must have at least one or two other kids, because, they were madly in love, and you think that Niles and Daphne wouldn't simply stop at one, if you know what I mean. I really wish that the funeral was actually an episode. I really do. That was one thing I had in the back of my head as a way to bring back the show, where Frasier would actually go back to Seattle for an episode or a special, and you would have Niles there, you'd have Daphne there, and you'd be introduced to David. And I thought that would be a good way to have done a send-off for Martin, but I guess since David Hyde Pierce and Jane Leaves, who played Niles and Daphne, are not currently interested in coming back, I guess they couldn't really do that, so they had to do the next best thing and just mention that the funeral happened off screen. Anyways, I'm glad that they did pay homage and respect to Martin Crane and John Mahoney. But yeah, Niles and Daphne briefly get mentioned. So I'm sure they'll get mentioned more throughout the series, because obviously their son is a main character in the new show, which is weird because the series finale ends with David being born. And now we see David fully grown as a young man. So the first episode ends with Frasier moving to Boston, taking up the position at Harvard, and he's wanting to show Freddie, Eve, and John his new apartment, which is basically right across the hall from Freddie and Eve's apartment. But there's more. Not only does he have this new apartment, Frasier bought the entire building. The entire apartment building he bought. Well, because he's obviously ridiculously wealthy from successful years being in radio and TV. So he probably has tons of money stashed away just sitting there. So So obviously Frasier could easily buy an apartment building, which means he's become a landlord. So we may see an aspect of Frasier where he has to deal with tenants. Oh, that'll be interesting. But he makes a deal with Freddie and Eve. If Freddie moves across the hallway with Frasier, then Eve can live in Freddie's old apartment with John rent-free. And so Eve easily agrees to this. Plus, she's already grown a certain liking to Frasier. And it's weird because when she first enters the screen, like early on in the episode, she mentions something about how Freddie should turn off the TV because she hears an episode of his dad's show airing, which implies that even though Freddie and Frasier were not close, that Freddie was still watching his dad's show on TV. At least that's what I gathered from it. But we also learned that Eve and Freddie like to lie a lot. They're habitual liars, and Freddie lies in both episodes. Like in the second episode, he lies to his firefighter buddies about Frasier being dead. He's like, my father's dead. Even though you have this celebrity show up in the bar named Dr. Frasier Crane, for some reason, none of these firefighters can connect the fucking dots. Don't they know that Frederick's last name is Crane? Isn't that strange that a Dr. Frasier Crane would happen to come into this bar and want to talk to Freddie Crane? I'm just saying, guys. I mean, sure, one or two of you should be able to connect the dots a lot quicker. So they made this whole thing about how Freddie was telling people that his father was dead and that his father was this and his father was that. And then Frasier basically like takes one for the team and saves Freddie's reputation and throws Lilith under the bus. This part was hilarious. He basically says that Lilith told Freddie that his father was many different things. Like she thought that his father was a plumber or a mechanic. I think it was a mechanic and plumber. If I'm wrong about that, then my bad. But then she thought that Freddie's father could be a successful psychiatrist. And so he did this whole thing like, yeah, I just recently got the DNA test while in Chicago. And wow, I just found out that Freddie's my son. And the firefighters actually believed it. So there's obviously potential for this to be a decent series. I think that it unfortunately is in the shadows of such a legendary sitcom like the original Frasier. It's hard that it's ever going to be able to get out of that shadow. I don't think it ever will, but it still could become a decent enough sequel series in its own right. Now let's talk about the similarities between the two shows, because there's unfortunately a lot of similarities. And I think that there's going to be a lot of retreading too. And like Frasier fans like myself that, you know, have watched the series a few times or currently binge watching it again, I think that we're going to see storylines and similar characters. And we're going to be like, hey, I've seen this one. It's a classic. Or you're going to be like, I get the reference. Like Frasier mentioned how he spent too much time in a bar last time he lived in Boston. Now, the characters that he was talking to, Alan, which is supposed to be this old friend of his, fellow professor at Harvard now, and Olivia, probably have no idea what the hell he's talking to. So it's kind of like a fourth wall thing that Frasier says. And we'll talk more about Cheers in a minute, because Cheers was technically the original show in this universe. You had Cheers, you had Frasier, now you have Frasier 2023. But I do feel like there's going to be way too many similarities between Frasier and Frasier 2023, and it might actually hurt Frasier 2023. I hope I'm wrong about that. I want this show to find its own footing and its characters to become their own thing, but I fear there might be some copy pasta. Now with Frasier, obviously Frasier's Frasier. That's just inescapable. But I do see a similarity between Frasier and Freddie's relationship, just like Frasier and Martin's relationship, which once again, as we talked about a moment ago, makes sense. This one works because, you know, grandfathers, grandsons, you know, there's often a similarity between the two. Like my papa told me once, the main reason why grandparents and grandchildren get along is because they have a common enemy. But yeah, so it's no surprise that Freddie would take more after his grandfather than his father or his mother, even though Frasier does mention how Freddie does have like witty comebacks like Lilith, but maybe a little bit of Martin, a little bit of Lilith there, maybe a little bit of Frasier and Freddie. But it's the other comparisons that kind of worry me a little bit. And I feel like it's going to be copy pasta of characters to some degree. And I'm sure they'll change it up a little bit and try to make these characters different. But it seems apparent that there's templates being used from pre-existing characters throughout the original series. So Alan, Frasier's best friend. Niles, Frasier's brother and best friend. So I feel like there's going to be a lot of similarities between like Frasier and Alan, just like with Frasier and Niles. But it's like a lesser extent. It's like replacing like Curly and Shemp with Curly Joe. It just won't work as well. Yeah, that's the Three Stooges reference in case you were wondering. But anyways, you also have David, right? Now, this is another interesting character because you could also make the argument that David is half Niles, half Daphne. So that's going to be interesting to see how his character plays out. And the bond that he's going to develop not only with Frasier as his nephew, but also with Freddie because, you know, Freddie and David are cousins. Now, there's an age gap between like Freddie and David. I think it's at least a decade and a half because I think Freddie was in his teens when David was born. So there's a gap between Freddie and David. But I can see a little bit of Daphne, a little bit of Niles and Freddie. It'll be interesting to see how that works out for David. It might work, it may not work. But then we have Eve. So Eve is potentially Daphne, like this version of Daphne, even though she's not British, but she is a potential love interest for Freddie, even though they're just friends right now. And like her boyfriend died and was best friends with Freddie, and now she's raising like there's, you know, John. It is possible that Freddie develops a father relationship with John. That wouldn't shock me at all because John's going to know Freddie since he was a baby. And it seems apparent that there is chemistry between Eve and Freddie. And over time, it would not surprise me if something more happens between Eve and Freddie and they actually become romantic. Unless Freddie turns out to be gay, because that was one of the things I thought was going to happen in the first episode, because like Freddie was keeping the secret from Frasier about how Eve wasn't really his girlfriend. And at first I was thinking, oh, are they going to turn Freddie gay? I mean, that's still a possibility. And if it is, whatever. But I think the direction they're going to go is they're going to make like Freddie and Eve eventually a thing. I don't know if they're going to like drag it out the way they did Niles and Daphne, but hopefully it's not dragged out that long because yeah, they dragged that one out way too long. But you could tell there was an affection between Niles and Daphne from almost the beginning. I think they didn't officially meet till episode 3 in the first season. So they actually like padded the time between these characters, allowing them to be fleshed out a little bit. So I hope they do the same thing. But the problem is the original series had 24 episodes a season, and this series has 10 episodes. Same runtime. Well, I don't know. I think the runtime on the new series is like basically maybe like 10 minutes longer. But still, I feel like there's going to be some similarities between Eve and Daphne. Maybe not completely. Maybe Eve will become her own character because she already has a child, or maybe she'll become similar to Roz. But I also see similarities with Olivia and Roz, and a little bit of BB, because BB was obsessed with like making Frasier as successful as possible, and that would make her a success. You know, BB was Frasier's agent. I wonder if we'll see BB again. I think the actress that plays BB is still alive. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see her have a reoccurring role in the future. But maybe that's an insult to Olivia. Maybe we shouldn't compare her to BB. But there's definitely going to be a similarity between Olivia and Roz, even though Olivia is technically Frasier's boss and Alan's boss. And Frasier was Roz's boss. But yeah, there's obviously similarities. But there's also going to be reoccurring characters. Speaking of Roz, she's supposed to return. I don't think she'll be like a regular character, but it'll be cool to see Roz come back and see what Roz has been up to in the past 20 years. So that'd be fascinating. And there's also going to be another character, which goes all the way back from Cheers to Frasier. And it's a very important character in both Frasier and Frederick's life. That's Lilith. So Lilith is confirmed to return as well. It would be nice if we did eventually see Niles and Daphne come back to, the show as at least a cameo role. Maybe in like one episode we see them pop in to visit David and Frasier. It would make sense. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I don't think we're going to see them appear in the first season. But if the show gets picked up for future seasons, it's possible that maybe David Hyde Pierce and Jane Leeves might be persuaded to at least come in for an episode or two. That'd be awesome. I think that's something a lot of the Frasier fans would like to see, especially the fact that you have David, their son. It would be nice to see that relationship, right? And it'd be nice to see, a little bit of something between Niles and Frasier after 20 years. So let's talk about Cheers characters, because this is going all the way back. Now, I wasn't as big of a Cheers fan because I was a kid when Cheers aired, and I was basically a teen somewhere in that department when Frasier aired, because I became more attached to Frasier than Cheers. But I did watch a few episodes of Cheers, and I already knew about Frasier. Frasier was already an established character, and that's the reason why I watched Frasier, was because I was already aware of the fact that he came from Cheers, which was a pretty good show. I vaguely remember it. And I still remember the little intro that Kelsey Grammer recorded when he was promoting Frasier on NBC. I think he mentioned something. He was sitting in a chair. I could be wrong. And he says, "If this isn't a hit, I walk." But lucky for him and everybody else involved in Frasier, it turned out to be a massive hit. So Cheers characters that could return if they're still living in Boston. And I double checked. I think the actors that play these characters are still alive. And if I'm wrong about one or two of them, I do apologize. Obviously, Ted Danson's still alive, famous for playing Sam Malone. Diane Chambers, Shelley Long. I think Shelley Long's still alive. So Sam and Diane could still be around. Carla could still be around. Norman Cliff and, Woody Harrelson, he's obviously still around. He played Woody. It's hilarious, though, because Woody Harrelson became extremely popular after Cheers. He rose to superstar status. But the first character he was known as playing was Woody in Cheers, even though that's his name in real life, Woody. Completely different than the character Woody. So you could see Sam, Diane, Carla, Norm, Cliff, and Woody maybe make future appearances in Frasier 2023, especially, like I said, if they're still alive, if their actors and actresses that play those characters are still alive and able, still willing, and if they still live in Boston, it would make sense. It's one thing to expect them to make appearances every now and then in Frasier when he lived in Seattle, and a few of them did appear in an episode or two. But it obviously makes more sense for them to appear in this show since it's set in Boston. Which is why I believe that Lilith should not just be a reoccurring character. She should actually be elevated to a regular character. Maybe she will by the second season. Because Lilith is obviously important to Frasier and Freddie. Well, probably more important to Freddie since, she is his mom than Frasier. But they have kind of a frenemy thing, throughout the years of Frasier. They became kind of friendly-ish towards each other, post-divorce. So it would make sense for Lilith to be more than just a reoccurring character, because you'd think she'd want to be involved in Freddie's life, especially since she has some competition now with Frasier back in Boston. But that also depends on whether or not Lilith is still living in Boston. So, yeah, I think that even if Roz just shows up for a cameo episode or a couple episodes, and maybe every now and then Roz flies from Seattle or wherever she's living now to visit Frasier, which makes less sense because, it's across the country. The character that does make sense to have as a regular on this show, hopefully going into the second season, is Lilith, because of the fact that she has this connection to not only the city of Boston, but to Frasier and especially to Freddie. So, yeah, maybe they'll end up doing that going into the second season. I hope there's a second season. I look forward to watching the other 8 episodes of Frasier throughout the next few months, going all the way to December 7th. That's when the finale is going to air. So hopefully Paramount Plus will see enough numbers, enough views for these episodes of Frasier 2023 to justify future seasons. But there was a quote I came across that pretty much describes this series so far that I would like to read to you. Quote unquote, Frasier 2023 scores as comfort viewing, even if it can't quite compare to the classic original series. And with that, I wholeheartedly agree. I don't think that was ever Kelsey Grammer or the producer or writer's intention to try and best the original series. You just can't do it. But it could still be a decent sitcom in its own right. And if they respect the characters and the canon, the lore of Cheers and Frasier into Frasier 2023, and if it all ends up connecting and making sense and working, then I think the show will be fine. And it's my hope that they have good writers and good directors and the producers, including Kelsey Grammer, involved. I know that the show has started off kind of a little rusty. It's not off to a bad start. It's not off to a great start either, because you can go back and watch the first episode of the first season of Frasier and be hooked from the very beginning, even though it wasn't shot on widescreen. You know, it's back on when it was not widescreen, so it's very dated, but still everything else is slapping, right? The characters from the beginning, their stories, the acting, the jokes are landing. The first season was great. You know, it was 24 episodes, and yet I cannot really cite a single episode that I hated. I mean, there were some weak episodes, but overall, really good first season. And the show got better and better with each passing season until its later seasons. Then it started to slip just a little bit. But I got to say it right now, at the moment, I feel like whatever you want to consider this show to be, whether it's like I jokingly called it season 12 of Frasier, it might as well be season 12 of Frasier. It's got a lot of work to do in order to get close to the later seasons of the show that it's a sequel of. Because it really is hard to decide what this is. Is it a continuation? Is it a reboot? Is it a soft reboot? Is it a new series? If it's a new series, then why is it called by the same name? That's the part that annoys me, because you have Cheers, you have Frasier, and I guess they just couldn't come up with something that would work for the name of this series besides just saying, hey, we'll just call it Frasier. And we'll just use the same font, and we'll use the Boston skyline instead of the Seattle skyline for the logo. So for all intents and purposes, it might as well just be season 12 of Frasier. At least that's the way I look at it. But it does suffer because of the fact that you have these characters that are new, that are going to need time to flesh out and for the viewers to bond with and for them to grow and to learn more about them and the chemistry to be built between them and the other characters, including older characters like Frasier and Lilith and Freddie, even though Freddie's played by a new actor, unlike I think younger Freddie was played like one or two different actors in the older series, I believe. But still the character, right? You talk about the character of Freddie. Freddie, the character, was already established. So I think that for the most part, before I wrap up, I think the actors and the actresses casted for these characters are okay. It's just going to take them time, and the writing will hopefully be polished, improved, and buffed out in order for this show to really start slapping and popping. It doesn't have the luxury of a 24-episode season. It only has 10 episodes to win over the audience. So a lot of work that this show has to do over the next 8 episodes to justify future seasons. But at the moment, I'm giving this series, based off the first 2 episodes, a 6.5 out of 10. Hopefully that number will climb by the season finale. And I really do want it to be a season finale and not a series finale. I would like to see this show go on for at least a few seasons. Maybe not as long as the original Frasier series did, but at least maybe 4 or 5 seasons. Well, about 50 episodes. That'd be kind of cool. Then again, maybe Paramount Plus will order future seasons and give future seasons more episodes. Maybe not 24 episodes, but maybe like 12 or 14 episodes so that things can get fleshed out a little bit more. Because, like I said, that first episode really, really did feel rushed. And I think it could have worked a little bit better as like a special. But I think the problem is they just couldn't get David I. Pierce or Jane Leeves on board. But maybe if they would have, at least for the special, then that would have gotten this revival, this reboot, this new, not so new series off to a good start. But it is what it is. I really wish they would have clarified this a little bit better and just simply said, hey, this is season 12 of Frasier. This is a continuation of the original series. It's not a reboot. It's not a revival. It's not a new show. It's just picking up 20 years after the end of season 11. Would definitely make it feel a lot less confusing in my book, because it feels like a duck, it walks like a duck, and it kind of quacks like a duck. It's basically a duck. It's basically season 12 of Frasier. Anyways, let me know what you think about this series so far. What you're liking about it, what you'd like to see improved, characters you'd like to see return from the original Frasier, and perhaps even Cheers. And do you think that this series has any hope of future seasons, or do you think it's going to be one and done for Dr. Crane's return to Boston? Your thoughts, views, and opinions, as always, welcome below in the comments section.